And we'll go next to Rafal.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I would like to say I agree with the previous speakers. We are talking about a global issue, but I think the Polish case is a little bit special, and I hope it does not sound too nationalistic if I say that. Why is that? I think Poland has been often referred to as a successful example of democratic transition, of democratic transformation over the last 3 decades. It has often been referred to as the model of positive democratic transformation, and I think in a way Poland has demonstrated that some of the assumptions of the science of democratic transformation have been weak. I think some of the assumptions that we witnessed, that we experienced in Poland and elsewhere, especially in the 90s, and especially on the part of the so-called liberal elites. I think a big part of those assumptions amounted to a linear model of transformation. So something that takes us from point A to point B, and it's a process that is a one-way process, a one-way street, so to say. And I think what we have seen in the last years is the opposite of that. I think we have what we have seen, what we have witnessed, tells us that democratic transformation is not a one-way street, and this assumption has been proved wrong. And I think since at least 2015, we could talk about a crisis of democratic culture and democratic values in the case of Poland. But if we look at the electoral campaign, the presidential campaign last year in 2020, I think we could really talk about a breakdown of democratic culture and democratic standards of political discourse at the very mainstream of democratic debate. And what the campaign last year amounted to really was the vilification of minorities. It was very much focused on the vilification of LGBT people, and it was very much focused on playing the anti-Semitic card. And I think for many different reasons, this is striking and shocking to note in the 21st century in the heart of Europe, that a successful political campaign could really focus so much on such tropes. And I also want to touch upon the issue of internationalization of nationalism, which is of course a paradoxical phenomenon. But if you look at the so-called Independence Day March in Poland every year on the 11th of November, it's a march organized by far-right nationalist groups, which started as a small event, but it became bigger and bigger every year. and by now it became the biggest far-right nationalist event in Europe, or probably in the world. And interestingly and paradoxically, it is no longer just a Polish event, because it brings together far-right nationalist and racist groups from all over Europe and beyond. And I think it symbolizes and illustrates this really paradoxical aspect of the internationalization of the far-right movement. But the internationalization of the far-right is not only illustrated in terms of street marches. It is also illustrated on the level of parliamentary politics. And I actually want to mention the role of the British Conservative Party in this, because well, that was relatively well covered. You know, the role that the British Tory Party played in forming alliances with far-right groups in the European Parliament before Brexit. But let's not forget that after Brexit, Britain still remains a member of the Council of Europe, which includes the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. And if you look at the composition of the political groups within the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, I think few people realize that the British Conservative Party is there in one group, in alliance, so legitimizing far-right parties from across the continent, including Germany, including Poland and Italy and many other countries. So I think this aspect is relatively you know, it is still relatively under-researched, and I think it should be talked about much more. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Rafal.
Well, that's really interesting. I'd like to respond to one or two points that were made. I think it would be interesting to you know, to focus a little bit on the context of the pandemic, and if we think back to March last year, the Polish government was one of the first to close the borders. I think it was an instinctive reaction to the pandemic, which may have been justified. And it may have been a right decision, but I think in some ways you could call it an instinctive response dictated by authoritarian protectionism, or protectionist authoritarianism, if you like. And you might think that this kind of response would have served the ruling party okay. Well, yes and no, because what we have seen in the last months is the relative success of the political groups to the right of the ruling party. Those groups that spread conspiracy theory around the pandemic, including anti-Semitic conspiracy theory around the pandemic, that have capitalized on the pandemic situation in a different way. So I think through legitimizing far-right discourse, the ruling party got the genie out of the bottle. And it is very, very challenging and very difficult to get it back into the bottle. So I think what the ruling party in Poland is facing today, through a lot of the mistakes that they have made in terms of legitimizing different types of far-right discourse, they are now facing a challenge parties that are even more nationalistic or more authoritarian to the right of the ruling party, and I think that is one of the paradoxes of the current situation. I also want to mention, well, Luisa alluded to the issue of humanities, and I think I can relate to it, to that, you know, thinking about the broader issue of education as well as higher education in Poland today. So I know that may be sounding shocking to you, but let me quote one politician who played a big role in the presidential campaign last year, who said repeatedly and publicly about on television about LGBT people. He said, these are not normal people. Let's stop all this nonsense about human rights and equality. And it's a precise quote. A few months later, he was rewarded with a post of Minister of Education, and he is running the Ministry of Education and Higher Education today, and he is rapidly changing the school curriculum as well as rules of higher education institutions, which I think shows how directly the far right can affect and undermine the very principles, the very fundamental principles of the of education understood as a humanist enterprise, and I'm afraid we are facing this challenge in a very direct way, in a very crude way. And of course we can we can have a very refined intellectual debate about it, but at the end of the day we are faced with some very crude and very direct and very radical challenges here. Thank you. If I may, let me start by addressing the question of civil society. Of course, it has been mentioned many times over the last years that one good thing about the Polish situation is the existence of a vibrant civil society, and that includes civil society protest against nationalist populism or authoritarianism, and we have seen many spectacular examples of mass protest against certain moves or certain policies. But I'm afraid at the end of the day, when you have this kind of mass movement, you kind of expect success, and if you don't obtain success, I think disappointment is very bitter. And there is this kind of anticlimax, which I think is also important, and it can also be quite negative. So I think obviously it is very important to sustain civil society, independent civil society, but in itself it is not a solution to a crisis of democracy, or not the only solution. And I also want to say, of course, for countries in Central and Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, the European Union is a very important point of reference, and the European institutions are a very important point of reference. But again, I would say the the reaction to the crisis of democratic values from the European Union institutions hasn't really had much impact, meaningful impact, to be frank. And I think we are also witnessing a kind of anticlimax in terms of expectations from the pro-European public opinion in Poland. But I also wanted to say something positive for once, and I thought, well, actually, we are now right in the middle of the European Football Championships. Okay, Poland is out, unfortunately, but I think we have seen some really good, spectacular examples of human rights advocacy from football players. I think especially German players, also English players, the England team, in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, in support of the gay rights movement. And I think that is actually very important, almost as important as any reaction we could expect from the European Union institutions. Popular culture is very significant in terms of setting standards and projecting certain values. So I think it's a positive example. It's a positive tournament in this sense. Thanks. Well, I wanted to return to the global context. I am a member of a civil society organization, the Never Again Association, that also has cooperation and projects in countries of Southeast Asia. And of course, until recently, we could talk about Poland as an example of successful democratic transformation, and that is much more difficult today in the context of Thailand or Cambodia. Poland is no longer the model country, I'm afraid, but I still think we have some important experiences to share. Like Luke said, we have some civil society activism that can be inspiring to others, I think. But if we think about Poland, I think I'm afraid the year 2015 was the watershed year, and we are not just talking about electoral cycles. We are talking about a much more profound change that has taken place. And actually, I'm really hoping everything I'm saying is incorrect, but I do think that something major really happened and really changed in Poland in 2015. And I'm not just talking about the change of government and the elections, but I'm talking about the impact of the European refugee crisis, which, as we know, did not really affect Poland directly, because very few of those refugees even intended to go to Poland, but it was framed in a very negative way in media and in political discourse, and it resulted in a big change of social attitudes and a big rise of xenophobia on a scale that we haven't, we did not see before, and I think we are still experiencing repercussions of that moment and that very big change in social attitudes, which fuel nationalist populism and fuel the forces of authoritarianism until today. And if you ask me about future, I think many of us are familiar with the the motto of Gramsci, you need to be a pessimist of the intellect, but an optimist of the will. There is another phrase from a Polish commentator. I don't want to mention his name, but he said, "Well, what is the difference between the optimist and the pessimist?" The pessimist says it cannot get any worse, and the optimist says yes, it can. And I'm afraid I'm a little bit of an optimist in this context, and I really hope I'm wrong here. Thanks.